Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're looking at a few things. The Security Council report's November forecast, a CSIS study on funding for emerging tech. Really fascinating stuff. And a Combating Terrorism Center report focused on counterterrorism.
Yeah, it's really striking to me how much the security landscape is shifting these days.
Definitely.
That whole global war on terror framing is fading, and U.S. policy is really putting a lot of emphasis now on strategic competition.
The Combating Terrorism Center report zeroes in on that.
Oh,
It's interesting, right? Because it's like counterterrorism isn't just about taking out threats. It's more and more about using it as a tool for global influence,
right.
especially, in this multipolar world with China and Russia in the mix.
Yeah, and that has big implications for how we think about things. We're seeing the U.S. kind of step back a bit from direct action and focus more on enabling partners instead. Like, take the Philippines. That expansion of the EDCA, that's a prime example of how we're trying to, intertwine counterterrorism with the bigger picture of strategic competition, especially as China is trying to, expand its influence there.
Yeah, it's a good example of a success story, but then you look at Iraq and, I don't know, it's kind of like a warning sign, too.
Yeah.
Remember the Iraqi counterterrorism service?
Yes.
The one we helped build up? Well, it's showing signs of backsliding. It's becoming more political, less effective. And it really highlights how hard it is to make these things sustainable over the long haul.
Mm-hmm.
Like building the capacity is one thing, but then how do you keep it going? It's tricky.
It really is, and it gets even trickier when you think about how terrorist groups are evolving. I'm seeing a trend where they're, I guess you could call it terrorist group expansion. It's like they're moving beyond their old stomping grounds.
Interesting.
Groups like ISK, they're not just aiming for regional power anymore. They want the global stage.
Yeah, and they're finding ways to get there. That ISK attack in Moscow earlier this year, in March, that was a real wake-up call. I mean, Russia's deadliest terrorist attack in like 2 decades.
Right.
It just shows how much these groups are adapting, how dangerous and sophisticated they're becoming. And not just regionally, globally.
And it's not just ambition either. It's that they're actually developing the capability to pull this off.
Yeah.
The report even flags al-Shabaab, They're talking about wanting to hit the U.S. homeland. They're actually trying to get the means to do it.
That's something to keep an eye on for sure. On the multilateral front, the Security Council report, well, it paints a pretty complicated picture. November's agenda is just jammed. Sudan, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, protection of civilians, North Korea, and that's not even everything. It makes you realize just how many crises are going on at once.
It really does raise questions about capacity, can the international community actually deal with all of this effectively? Mm-hmm. That potential discussion they're having about UN-AU cooperation, that's a really important one. Because it gets to the heart of how we can make multilateralism work better, how do we actually address these multifaceted crises?
These crises are all tangled up together, too.
Exactly.
The violence in Sudan, it's spilling over into the Abyei region. The Israel-Hamas war, well, that's fueled tensions in Syria and Lebanon. The whole region's a tinderbox.
Yeah, and then you add in North Korea sending troops to Russia. That's a whole other layer of complexity. Mm-hmm. It could have a huge impact on the Ukraine conflict and, who knows what else.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to keep track of. We're dealing with this web of interconnected challenges. But on top of that, the counterterrorism community is facing another challenge. And it's almost a paradox. Yeah. We've got more data than ever before, but are we any closer to actually understanding what it all means?
That's a really good point. It's information overload.
Exactly.
The Combating Terrorism Center report, they really hit on this. They say we need much better information sharing. But the thing is, even with everything we learned after 9/11, we're actually seeing a backslide in that area.
Really? It's like we're going backward.
It seems like it, yeah.
So how do we fix that? They talk about AI and machine learning, right?
Uh-huh.
For data analysis. But they're also cautious about it. Like, it's not a magic solution.
Right. It's not like you just plug in the data and get all the answers. You still need human analysts, data scientists, people who can understand what the data means and actually guide these AI applications.
But working smarter, not harder. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That part about prioritizing really resonated with me. We can't get bogged down in the sheer volume of data. We have to figure out which signals are actually important.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a concept from the Global Initiative report. They're talking about a 5th wave of organized crime. They're building on that framework they use to analyze waves of terrorism, but they're saying organized crime is going through its own evolution in response to these global trends.
That's an interesting idea.
It is.
So what makes this 5th wave different?
Well, it's all about how deeply it's intertwined with stuff like geopolitical competition, climate change, and technological advances. And then there's how the lines between legal and illegal activities are getting blurrier and blurrier.
Okay, I'm following.
Think about state-embedded organized crime things like North Korea's Office 39 or Iran's IRGC.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
These groups are operating with a level of sophistication and influence that's, you know, it's practically on par with actual states. And then you've got these fragile states, the ones struggling with climate change and displacement. They're becoming hotbeds for this kind of activity.
So it's like a perfect storm, right?
It is. It's like all these factors are feeding into each other, creating this really toxic mix.
That's a pretty grim outlook.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you've got the whole issue of AI being used for criminal purposes.
Oh, right. That's huge.
It means more sophisticated cyber attacks, malware, social engineering, you name it.
And it makes these smaller criminal organizations potentially much more dangerous because they can suddenly punch way above their weight.
Exactly.
The report calls it the rise of murky markets, where it's getting harder and harder to tell what's legal and what's not.
Right, and that's a whole other challenge on top of everything else.
This is getting pretty complex.
It is.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to talk about, and that's urbanization. It's happening everywhere, and it's having a huge impact on peace and security.
It's one of those things that often gets overlooked, but the Global Initiative report really dives into it. They highlight all these challenges that cities are facing: armed conflict, organized crime, climate change, poverty, inequality. It's a lot.
It's like all these threats converging in one place.
Exactly. Like, look at the Lake Chad region.
Okay.
Armed groups are increasingly targeting smaller towns and cities. It's disrupting trade. It's disrupting the movement of people. It's a mess. And then there's the whole trend of urban warfare, which is so different from traditional conflict. Think about Grozny, Mosul, those cities in Syria and Yemen. The battleground is shifting to urban environments.
It's a whole different kind of warfare.
Exactly. And then you have the issue of informal settlements expanding in cities across the global south.
Right?
That creates opportunities for criminal governance, for violence, places like Guasmo, Ecuador. The report uses that as an example. It's a stark reminder of how poverty and lack of opportunity can breed instability and fuel criminal activity.
So these problems are interconnected in all sorts of ways.
They are.
It's not just about conflict or crime. It's about poverty, inequality, development. It's all tied together.
And then you look at places like Rio de Janeiro, where you have militias controlling urban development and land. They're like these shadow governments operating through violence and intimidation.
So the question is, what do we do about all this? How can we actually address these converging security threats, especially in these increasingly urbanized and often fragile environments?
It's the million-dollar question.
It is. And it's one that's going to require some really innovative thinking and a whole lot of collaboration if we're going to find solutions that actually work. And on that note, I think it's time to move on to our next segment. We're going to take a closer look at the world of funding for emerging technologies, particularly those with security applications. It's really interesting to think about how we can use technology to actually counter these threats. We were just talking about how terrorist groups are exploiting technology. What about flipping the script and leveraging it for counterterrorism and broader security goals?
That's a big focus in both the CSIS and the Combating Terrorism Center reports. There's a real sense that we need to go beyond those traditional approaches and embrace these new technologies and strategies, especially when you look at just how big this challenge is.
The CSIS report really dives into that funding landscape for emerging technologies, particularly the ones with security applications. It seems like there's a big shift away from those traditional government-led funding models.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is that the report highlights how the U.S. is actually trying to attract private sector investment in these areas, especially with competition from China heating up. It's like they're realizing that the government can't go it alone anymore.
And the numbers are pretty amazing. I mean, the sheer amount of private capital flowing into emerging tech, it's way more than what the government's putting in. It seems like that creates both opportunities and challenges for policymakers who are trying to make sure those investments align with national security goals.
And the report has this interesting observation about the Department of Energy. They've always been big on supporting innovation, especially in things like nuclear energy and supercomputing.
So how does that translate to national security?
Well, they're basically applying that same innovation-focused mindset to foster development in those critical tech sectors that are relevant to national security, things like AI and advanced materials. They're kind of becoming this key player in bridging that gap between cutting-edge research and real-world security applications.
And what about the Small Business Administration? It seems like they're getting more involved too.
Right. So traditionally, the SBA has been focused on, broad support for small businesses. But now there's this growing understanding that those businesses are a big part of developing these critical technologies. The report highlights how the SBA is using its loan programs to channel funding towards businesses operating in sectors like AI, cybersecurity, and biotechnology.
So we're talking about a whole of government approach here. Different agencies are stepping up, each one using its strengths to kind of boost innovation and help us keep that technological edge in this era of strategic competition.
But it's more than just throwing money at the problem. The report emphasizes how important it is to create this ecosystem that encourages innovation, fostering collaboration between the public and private sectors, and making that whole government contracting process, which can be a real pain, much smoother.
There's a lot of focus on communication and outreach, building those connections between the innovators and the policymakers.
Exactly. It's not just about handing out money. It's about creating that shared understanding of what the challenges are and what the opportunities are.
Now, the Combating Terrorism Center report, it also talks about the need for adaptation and innovation, but from a different angle.
Yeah.
They're saying that our counterterrorism strategies need to keep up with this changing threat landscape, and they have this really interesting framework for thinking about counterterrorism in this new era.
Yeah, they highlight these 4 key areas: diplomacy, military force, law enforcement, and financial measures. Those aren't new concepts, but what the report emphasizes is the need for a more integrated and flexible approach. It's about understanding that all those elements are interconnected, and you can't just look at them in isolation.
So you're talking about using all the tools we have in a more strategic and coordinated way.
Right. For example, the report talks about how diplomacy is essential for building coalitions, getting access for operations, and shaping the overall environment for counterterrorism efforts. And they say military force, while still important, should really be a last resort, used strategically and alongside those other measures.
And they seem to put a lot of emphasis on law enforcement and financial measures, which honestly sometimes feel like they get less attention when we talk about counterterrorism.
And I think that's a mistake. They're really critical pieces of any comprehensive counterterrorism strategy. Law enforcement's vital for disrupting networks, gathering intel, and bringing those responsible to justice. And financial measures can be super effective when it comes to cutting off funding and weakening those organizations.
What really struck me was how they connected counterterrorism efforts to the broader idea of strategic competition.
It's a really important point. They're basically arguing that we need to stop thinking about counterterrorism as just fighting terrorism. It can also be this powerful tool for building relationships and alliances, and even shaping the narrative in key regions.
Like that Philippines example we were talking about earlier, the U.S. using its counterterrorism know-how to build those closer ties with the Philippines, basically as a counter to China's growing influence. It's about more than just military power, it's about strategic influence.
And it goes beyond even that. The report really emphasizes winning hearts and minds, building trust, promoting good governance. Those are all essential for a successful counterterrorism strategy over the long haul.
It's a more holistic approach, right? Recognizing that security is about more than just military strength. It also includes fostering stability, development, and good governance.
Absolutely, and that leads into another really important point they make, which is about understanding how terrorist groups are evolving. They're not static, they're constantly adapting, finding new ways to operate and meet their goals.
And that brings us back to that concept of terrorist group expansion. It's like groups like ISK are no longer satisfied with regional influence. They want to expand their reach and make an impact globally.
Yeah, and they're doing it for a few different reasons. Opportunity is one factor. That chaotic situation in Afghanistan created a vacuum that groups like ISK were really quick to take advantage of.
So they're seizing opportunities, but it's more than that, right? There's also that willingness to expand, this idea that they're part of this larger global struggle.
Exactly. And that willingness is often fueled by propaganda, social media, online networks that let them connect with potential recruits and supporters all over the world.
It's a reminder that the fight against terrorism isn't just happening on those traditional battlefields anymore. It's online. It's in the realm of ideas and narratives. It just highlights how important innovation and adaptability are in this fight.
We need to be just as nimble and resourceful as those groups are. We need new strategies, we need to be smart about how we use technology, and we need to find ways to disrupt their networks and undermine their narratives. We have to get inside their heads and figure out what makes them tick and then stay one step ahead.
I think that's a good place to take a break. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still more to unpack. When we come back, I really want to dig into that fifth wave of organized crime idea, this whole concept of climate change fueling these networks, how those lines between what's legal and illegal are getting blurry, and how these groups are getting more and more sophisticated, especially with their use of technology. It's all pretty unsettling. So we were just talking about how organized crime is evolving and this unsettling fifth wave concept. It seems like you have all these factors converging: geopolitical shifts, climate change, technology, and it's creating a whole new landscape for these criminal organizations.
You know, the Global Initiative report really emphasizes how this fifth wave is all about how deeply organized crime is becoming integrated with those big geopolitical rivalries. It's like the lines between actual states and criminal groups are blurring.
Yeah,
Think about North Korea's Office 39, using all those illicit activities to fund the regime,
right.
or Iran's IRGC, involved in everything from heroin trafficking to really advanced cybercrime.
It's like these groups are almost becoming shadow states in their own right. They have this kind of influence and power that rivals, maybe even surpasses legitimate governments.
Exactly. And what's really worrying is how this fifth wave seems to be exploiting those fragile states, the ones already struggling with climate change and all those displaced people.
It's like a recipe for disaster.
It is. Imagine a country dealing with droughts, floods, not enough resources, weak government, and people who are just desperate.
It's a breeding ground for organized crime.
It is. They come in and fill that void where the state has failed.
So climate change is almost like a catalyst, right? It's speeding up the growth of these criminal networks.
Absolutely. And then you add in how criminal organizations are using technology, especially AI.
Right, that's huge.
It's like a whole new level of sophistication. Cyber attacks that can take down critical infrastructure, AI-powered malware that can adapt and learn and dodge detection, social engineering scams that can trick anyone.
Yeah, it's scary how convincing some of those scams are getting.
It is, and it means even small criminal organizations can cause huge damage.
The report talks about these murky markets emerging. It's like those lines between what's legal and what's not are getting almost impossible to see.
Right. It's a whole new challenge. You know, we used to think of organized crime as dealing in things that were clearly illegal: drugs, weapons, fake products. But now, with these global supply chains and AI being used everywhere, it's so hard to trace where things come from.
You can launder pretty much anything these days. It's like a nightmare for law enforcement.
It really is.
It feels like we're moving into this new era of criminality, and it's more complex, more connected, and potentially much more destabilizing than anything we've seen before.
And it's all happening as the world is rapidly urbanizing, with cities becoming both the targets and the platforms for these evolving types of crime.
The report uses Guasmo, Ecuador, as an example. It's a neighborhood struggling with poverty, no opportunities, and weak governance.
And that makes it a prime target for those criminal organizations involved in that transnational cocaine trade.
Right, because cities are these global hubs for trade and finance. They become the perfect launch pads for these illegal activities to reach those international markets.
Exactly. And Guasmo being so close to that major port really illustrates that.
It's a reminder that these security challenges aren't just happening over there somewhere. They're right here, right now, affecting millions of people around the world.
Absolutely. And we need to understand that traditional law enforcement just isn't going to cut it anymore. We have to change how we think about this, invest in preventing these problems, and address those root causes.
So we're talking about things like poverty, inequality, and weak governance.
Exactly.
So what can the international community actually do? Where do we even begin to address these huge interconnected challenges?
Well, first we have to recognize that this isn't just a law enforcement problem. Everyone has a role to play: governments, civil society, the private sector, and local communities.
So it's about collaboration, right? Bringing everyone together.
Exactly, and these criminal networks work across borders, so our responses have to be transnational too. We have to break down those silos, share information, and coordinate strategies. We can't just react to these threats after they happen. We have to invest in preventing them by addressing the underlying conditions that allow them to flourish.
Things like closing loopholes, strengthening institutions, holding people in power accountable.
Exactly. We have to get serious about tackling corruption, shutting down money laundering operations, and putting strong regulations in place that make it much harder for these groups to operate.
It's a tall order, but it sounds like the alternative is pretty terrifying.
It is. We're talking about potentially undermining trust in institutions, destabilizing whole regions, and losing countless lives. Security in the 21st century demands a new way of thinking, one that recognizes just how interconnected all these challenges are and how much we need to work together.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. As we wrap up, I'm left feeling like we need to act now, but I'm also hopeful. By understanding these trends, working together, and coming up with creative solutions, we can build a more peaceful and secure future for everyone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.